Now, let's start off with this. Let's start with you, Katie. What do you think about this? On the back of these bushfires, so many people trying to link the bushfires to climate change for political reasons. So Albo says we need a national bushfire summit.
Oh, look, I don't think that you can start politicising these types of natural disasters. I think when you start doing that, it's when people from either side either get really irate at politicians for involving themselves in these kinds of discussions, or, you know, they start to use things like the bushfires as ammo for their own arguments. I really believe that you can't actually leverage on people's misery to try and make it help you get through your political argument. And I feel as though we need to sort of wait and let things calm down. I know that Queensland, unfortunately, are just entering really the beginning of their fire season, but I don't think that you need to make this a political issue. I know that's a tough argument to have when you're talking about climate change, or when some people are making it an issue about climate change, and really it becomes something that gets so sort of emotive and emotional rather than being able to have a sensible discussion about it.
Yeah, you're spot on, but Tanvir, to me, most people would agree with that. They don't want politics in this. It's insulting to talk about these episodes in relation to climate change. It's insulting to voters what they don't remember fires, catastrophic fires 10 years ago, 30 years ago on Ash Wednesday, back in the 60s, back in the 30s. They know all this. We've got to deal with fires, and we always will. What are they pretending? We have some emissions trading scheme and we're not going to get bushfires anymore?
Well, the hysteria seems to be just accelerating regarding it, and it is a global phenomenon. So when there is something quite tangible, like weather, there's a huge temptation to try and, you know, to link it in with the global apocalypse, as we know. And look, having said that, the Prime Minister has been open, saying, look, we accept, like insurers, we expect, you know, some changes, alterations in weather patterns, but jumping on every weather event and going, hey, the apocalypse is coming. But not only is it over the top, but you'll also get the cry wolf type syndrome.
Well, this is the problem,
you know,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this false hope that somehow you can stop this. And, of course, there is science that says your fire seasons might get longer. They might not in other places. But, Gemma, this false hope that somehow we can do something with climate policy, and one of our most endemic threats, something we know we're all going to be battling with in decades to come regardless, somehow that's going to be ameliorated is just a nonsense.
Well, do we need a summit, Chris, to stop teenagers from lighting fires? I mean, is that what we're going to address
that
here?
Would
do
help.
We need a summit to, absolutely might help. Do we need a summit to empower government agencies to actually return to policies of responsible backburning? We don't need political parties, and in this case the Labor Party, and it's a bit cheap of Albo, I think, or Mr Albanese, it's a bit cheap of him to be using this in this way, because nobody wants a talk fest. And, you know, saying we're going to have a summit, and in this case a bushfire summit, is as attractive of saying, would you like a glass of you know, dysentery? It's not something the Australian public have any appetite for. We know what it means. We know that a summit is nothing more than a talk fest that wastes our money and everybody else's time and delivers very little in the way of outcomes. This has been a tragedy for those affected. There is no doubt that the climate has had has been a bit particularly bad fire season. It is not going to be impacted one iota by a bunch of politicians clawing for relevance and trying to get a seat at a table that they've no business trying to interfere with.
It's not just politicians, Katie. What about Prince Charles telling us 10 years on from his last tipping point, we've got another tipping point?
Yeah, again, I just find it interesting, the people that sort of ingrain themselves in these discussions. Now, I know that Prince Charles, I'm sure there's plenty of people around the world who are quite interested in what he's got to say, but he's not an expert in this space. And for me, especially when you're talking about the bushfires, I think if you want to actually have a genuine discussion with people about this, talk to some of the firefighters that are out there actually fighting these fires at this point in time. And if they're saying that there needs to be, that there needs to be responsibility responsible backburning, like Gemma had just mentioned, and I know that's something that we talk about quite a lot here in the Northern Territory, then we need to have that discussion. I don't think that sort of celebrities and royals at this point in time, I know that they're always going to try to sort of jump on those bandwagons when it comes to things like climate change. But we're here in Australia at the moment, we're dealing with an emergency in terms of bushfires. Now, that to me doesn't prove that there's a climate emergency. What it proves is that we do need to take a closer look at maybe why we're in the situation that we're in at the moment. But I think that you have those discussions with people like firefighters, people who are actually out there who've been fighting these fires for some time. Not the likes of Prince Charles on the other side of the world. It's this millennial thing, isn't it, Tanvir? I mean, it's like there's no history. The only thing, everything that's happening now must be happening for the first time. I mean, you only have
and the speed which these attitudes are changing. Like now we've got like everyone and their dog. But one of the myths I really hate in this whole debate is we get all these people saying we're doing nothing on climate change, and it's really kind of it makes me really angry. We're clearly it's a global effort. We're part of a wider plan. Obviously, we have 1.3% of the emissions. We're not going to fix it on our own. And we are doing our bit, and it requires calm, steady heads.
No one can come up with a country that's doing more, that's paying a higher price on this stuff. I keep asking the activists, the best they can come up with is Germany. There's some argument, Gemma, you could say Germany's paid a higher economic price than Australia on energy policy, possibly, although it's got all sorts of backup from neighbouring countries. We have to be self-reliant.
Yeah, and they have a completely different climate. I mean, obviously they have where we have heat pressures, they have the pressures of European winters. It's still not a fair comparison. The length and breadth of this country dwarfs Germany. It's a completely, it's a moot argument, if you ask me. And I totally agree with Tanvir in the sense of all of these people who seem to be pathologically wedded to this, diet of Armageddon and imminent destruction. It's actually a little bit disturbing from a psychological profile, because if that's where if that's like a license to not plan for your life, maybe that's what's going on here. But talking about Prince Charles for a second, can we please remember that, and I say this sincerely, this is a man who wanted to come back to Earth as a female sanitary product, and we are taking his word. We are taking his word and giving weight to what he says about the environment, which is we've got 10 years to make it right, otherwise we're all going up the Khyber. I mean, come on.
Let's not give Gemma,
weight to things.
You are talking about a man who is next in line to be the King of Australia. This is what worries me.
That's a whole other story.
That's a whole other story. But he's talking the same old pap 10 years on, Tanvir. Just going on from that point, though, your psychiatrist's analysis of this. There is this catastrophism. We see it all the time. Every generation talks about, you got the Club of Rome, we're all going to run out of food and resources. Then we had all the whole millennial bug thing, and now it's climate change. Of course, there are real issues to look at, but is there something in our psyche that makes us want to look at some impending doom?
Look, there are various theories, and certainly as we become less traditionally religious, there's certainly the view that, climate change has, because it's got such a moral dimension. So fear always has a bit of a moral dimension and often overlaps with what we might consider evil. And, so that's why you've got this real, not only emotive language, but also the language of good and evil. Yeah. And that's really playing out. And so it's really hard to just have sensible, rational debate. Go, look, we've got a plan. Meanwhile, let's invest in research around renewable energy. Let's take some risks here and there. And over time, we're going to chip away at it. And we keep fighting. And we've got to keep fighting.
Have a rational discussion and rational policy.
And through our policy and our stance globally, then we can exert pressure, hopefully, on countries like China, India, over time. That's the hope,
Katie?
Yeah, look, for me, when I see people gluing themselves to the ground, it actually makes me switch off to the point that they're trying to get across. And I think that you'll find that's probably the case with a lot of people. I start to think, well, if your point's a good one, you don't need to glue yourself to the ground to make it. I totally agree. I totally agree that if you want to actually have a serious discussion about these types of things, well, you're looking to engage people like me, like Middle Australia, like mums, you know, and just everyday working class people. Now, if you glue yourself to the ground, I'm not going to actually listen to the message that you're trying to get across.
Well,
I'll be much more inclined to listen.
And don't tell me that bushfires are new. And don't tell me that bushfires are new and we've never had them in spring before in northern New South Wales, and that they're their worst ever, and that was never had catastrophic conditions before, and all these sorts of lies that are perpetuated by the media, because, Gemma, you don't fool anybody.
No, you don't. And I think what was really telling during the week, Chris, was that story that you covered at length about the attempt for this solutions-based journalism up the road. I mean, if you can explain to me what that's supposed to be, that's a whole other conversation as well. But the responsibility to have a measured hand, and even the most cursory, even the most, you know, indifferent amount of research will find credible science challenging the popular narrative, which is we're all going to die in 10 years. You know, there is, to say the science is settled is to not understand science itself, which science is never settled. That's the whole point about it. It's always evolving. I mean, imagine 30 years ago, Chris, for example, if a doctor had have talked about it 40 years ago, if a medical doctor had have talked about the concept of neuroplasticity, which is the brain, and this is probably Tanvir's area, but the brain being able to change itself and all of that kind of thing, that would have been probably considered some kind of witchcraft. Now it's accepted practice. The science is not settled. It's never settled. And to my view, that is the biggest hole in the armour of these ridiculous, catastrophic morons who are trying to sell us beachfront land in Kalgoorlie.
One thing I'd add, Chris, I think you can tie it in more broadly with the activist left. What's happening, partly, is all these elections are going against them. So you're getting an extra desperation, and you're seeing that totalitarian edge of some of the activist left, not just on climate, but on other issues around, be it gender, race, where the underlying dynamic is one of remaking society. And we can't do it by the ballot box. It's morally acceptable to do it by force. So that's coming out a little bit on climate as well.
Well, and when they see a tragedy like bushfires, which sadly all generations of Australians have had to confront and deal with, they actually talk about it as if we've done this to ourselves. This is our self-inflicted punishment. This is Gaia getting back at us.
That's right,
It's really...
It's like Israel Folau or something. It's the same type of language.
Exactly. It's the same
type of language.
It's the same deal between the Greens and that fundamentalist line from Israel Folau that God was punishing us. It's a real worry.